This video is about Thomas King's The Back of the Turtle, specifically the character of Nicholas Crisp and the kinds of things that he represents in the story and the larger, say, narrative impulse of the novel. So, the central problem that the novel is dealing with is environmental catastrophe. Now, it's not an unfolding of environmental catastrophe. It's not the story of the big event, right? The big event has happened in the past, and it's Gabriel Quinn who is coming back to Samaritan Bay to try and think about the past and maybe make amends for the past. So it's not an action novel in that sense of this is the end of the world narrative, but it is still an end of the world narrative talking about bad environmental things that have happened. So the scientist who disappears, right? He has written all these other catastrophes that have happened, like Bhopal in India and various nuclear meltdowns and stuff. So this is a pattern that's recurring in the world. So part of the question that King is asking us is, how do we recover? Okay? And in this case, from environmental catastrophe, but from other catastrophes as well. So King is an Indigenous writer, and so we might ask questions: how do we recover from the mistreatment and genocide of Indigenous peoples in different parts of the world? How do we address those historical problems? Okay. So another thing it might be referring to is one of the kind of central myths of our culture, central stories, because King's all about stories, and that's the Christian fall, right? Fall of Adam and Eve from the Garden of Eden, right? How do we account for that original sin? How do we make things better, right? And so we have this back and forth reference. It's a reference to sins of the past, but also reference to sins in the potential future. So Quinn is trying to address the green sweep problem, but there's also this itinerant, this moving around ship of the Anguis in the novel as well, which represents the potential future catastrophe. So how do we deal with that, with having the knowledge? Remember that the fall of Adam and Eve is all about knowledge. We have knowledge of the Anguis, we have knowledge of climate change. How do we deal with the future? And interestingly, there's been books recently written by poets and ecologists and philosophers asking the question, how do we live with this knowledge of death? That is, if climate change goes on the worst possible trajectory that we can imagine and human extinction is a real possibility, how do we live with that fact? So, this is not something that we've necessarily done in the past, although it's influenced by past events. It's a catastrophe that still has yet to happen, yet we know that we're contributing to it. And so that's a kind of scary form of knowledge to understand or to think about. How do we make meaning of a life that is perhaps totally meaningless because there's nothing we can do in the face of catastrophe? So that's a nice, sunny, existential, angsty problem to start out with, right? How do we deal with that? And so King has his ideas and in the novel, and I'll get to this later on, but I'll say it now, is that he's imagining a resurrection of the community around Samaritan Bay, right? That these people are reconverging in different ways onto this community that had been abandoned. So Mara is returning to the reserve, Quinn is returning to the place where the green sweep disaster happened, and the Taiwanese immigrants find refuge there from their sinking ship. Crisp has always been there, and this is what we're going to talk about, or what I'm going to talk about in this video, mostly is Crisp, okay? So, I'll just point out that Dorian Asher is the kind of corporate bad guy in this novel, and I just mention him because there's a reference to his name later on, so I just want to remind you that his last name is Asher. And ash, of course, is what's left after fires, after catastrophic events. And ash is usually what color? Gray. possibly white or black, but gray, generally speaking. And if we take his first name, Dorian, and the last name, Ash, and if Ash is gray, we have Dorian Gray. It's a novel by Oscar Wilde, and it's about, I've actually never read it, I really should, but it's about the portrait of Dorian Gray. It's about a picture that ages rather than the man himself. And so it's about stealing youth. And so this is about life and death and how we grow old, and about regret and how we see ourselves in the narrative of our lives and the narrative of our futures and the broader social context that we find ourselves in.